Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello. Welcome back. I'm Rebecca, and I'm your host for The Bitter Witness. I hope you've had a good week. I've had a snowy, blowy, cold week here. I have decided that I really hate driving in the snow, which is weird to say because I literally live in one of the many snow belts of Ontario. But I really do. I've been driving for 35 winters now, and I'm pretty much done with it. I mean, it's enough. We're working hard on my bestie's play, which is her directorial debut, and things are going well. We're almost at the crunch time where all the backstage people start to panic and we think that we're never going to have enough time to do everything we want to. And then we always seem to pull it off and everything is perfect. But for the next 2 or 3 weeks, we'll all be living in chaos, which I have found is something I thrive on. Well, that's about it from my 15 below and freezing little corner of Ontario. Let's get the business out of the way, shall we? If you enjoy this episode or any episode, head on over to the Patreon page and give the show some love. For less than a pair of dollar store mittens a day, you can help keep these episodes going. The link for Patreon will be in the show notes. Or you can support the show on Spotify as well. Please like, follow, and share the show with everyone you know, and don't forget to give the show a 5-star review on Apple. And that's enough of the business. Let's get to this week's case. When I'm picking out my cases to do each week, I try and switch it up. A big one and then a smaller one, just meaning the amount of research that goes into the cases. I started this week's case and it seemed to be a smaller amount of research, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it grew into this behemoth of a case with twists and turns I never, even in a million years, saw coming. The dogs are sleeping behind me, so puppy ASMR will be brought to you by both Miley and Piper today. So grab a cup of tea, sit back, and relax while I tell you about the case of the murders of Steve Christensen and Kathy Sheets. As always, I want to give the victims in the case top billing. Steve, Kathy, to all their friends and family, and to all the other innocent people who were affected by this case, I acknowledge you and send my love to you, wherever you may be. The insidious hunger for attention can warp a person's moral compass, leading them down a dark path where the lines between right and wrong blur and eventually vanish. When that craving escalates into a desperate need to keep secrets hidden, the consequences can be catastrophic. Driven by a desire to feel powerful, to be noticed, to leave their mark on the world, this warped need for recognition becomes the foundation upon which horrific acts are built. Deception becomes a tool as they weave a complex web of lies to conceal their actions, a desperate attempt to control the narrative and avoid detection. For those who covet this desperate hunger for attention, murder is often viewed as simply a means to an end, a way to silence potential witnesses or further their twisted agenda. Lengths to which someone will go to protect their secrets become a chilling testament to the destructive power of an unchecked ego. The murders of Steve Christensen and Kathy Sheets is a grim illustration of how the desperate pursuit of attention can erode a person's humanity and lead them to commit the most unforgivable acts. On October 15, 1985, Janet McDermott stopped by her office on the 6th floor of the Judge Building, located in downtown Salt Lake City. She was only stopping in for a quick second to grab some paperwork and check her messages. She ran into a colleague of hers, Steve Christensen, in the hallway. They exchanged pleasantries, and Janet had to get the let out as she was running late for her appointment. As soon as she closed her office door, she heard a loud explosion, and her building shook. She ran out to the hall to see what had happened, and that is where she saw that the explosion had come from Steve's office. As she ran towards Steve's office, she could see Steve lying in the doorway of his office on his right side. His entire face was burned. There was a hole in his chest, and his entire body was covered in blood. Steve's partner, Randy Rigby, had a meeting with Steve that morning at 8 a.m., but Randy was running about 10 minutes late. Randy said he was walking towards the Judge Building when he saw all the police tape and cruisers all over out front of the building. He entered the building at the same time that the property manager was walking in. The two ran up the stairs to the 6th floor. Randy said he looked down the hall and saw the door to their office ripped right off the hinges, and there was debris everywhere. Randy stated in an interview that the property manager turned and looked at him and said, "What the hell kind of business were you two guys running out of that office?" Steve Christensen was 31 years old and a member of the Mormon Church. He was married to Terry, and together the two had started their family. We need to do a quick history on Mormonism and the LDS Church. It's important to the case. In 1829, a man named Joseph Smith translated words that he found on gold plates. He had found the gold plates because he was directed by an angel named Moroni, and these words from the plates formed the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith then formed a church called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Today, in modern times, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is one of the largest and wealthiest religions in America. Shortly before the bombing, Steve had purchased something called the Salamander Letter. The Salamander Letter was a letter written by Martin Harris to W. Phelps in 1830. Martin Harris had served as a scribe for Joseph Smith while he was translating the gold plates, and Phelps was an early leader in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This Salamander Letter basically said that a white salamander appeared to Joseph Smith and led him to the gold plates. And then the salamander transformed into a spirit and told Smith that he couldn't have the plates unless his brother Alvin was with him. But Alvin was dead. The letter then implies that the Smith family dug up Alvin's body in some kind of magical ceremony in order to allow Joseph Smith to obtain the gold plates. Now, this letter was highly controversial because, as you can imagine, the church didn't look too kindly on magic and all that goes along with it. Not only that, but it almost turned the origin of their religion into a folk tale of sorts. There is one thing that you need to remember about the Mormon faith. They are huge in finding historical documents, sort of akin to the Catholic religion. Think the vaults of the Vatican. The LDS, the Latter-day Saints, also have a vault in their main church in Salt Lake City. Inside the vault are thousands of historical documents and artifacts pertaining to Joseph Smith and the creation of their religion. The Salamander Letter was authenticated by a historical document dealer named Kenneth Randall, and the White Salamander Letter, well, its mere existence threw the foundation of the church into basically chaos. Steve had purchased the white Salamander Letter and donated it to the LDS Church. Because it was authenticated by Kenneth Randall, the church took the document and put it in their vaults, never to be seen again. When investigators arrived on the scene, they found that the blast had blown the door to Steve's office completely off the hinges. In fact, it had obliterated the door. And based on where the debris was found throughout the hallway, they could tell that the blast had happened right in front of the door to Steve's office. Once investigators had collected all the fragments found in the hallway and pieced it all back together, they discovered that what they were dealing with was a pipe bomb. Steve had been killed by a homemade pipe bomb. As well, while they were piecing it back together, investigators found a small scrap of brown paper with the word Steve written on it in black marker. As well, amongst the debris, they found parts of a motion-sensitive mercury switch. This led investigators to assume that there must have been some type of package that contained the pipe bomb located in front of Steve's office door. You see, a mercury switch like this would ignite the pipe bomb when the package was tilted. Interesting crime fact: bombs that are created with motion-sensitive ignition devices are for the most part delivered to their intended targets by the actual bombers themselves. This ensures the bomber that the device doesn't explode before it's delivered and that the device is placed where the target is going to see it and interact with it. These bombers are, for the most part, but not all of them, obsessive and control freaks who are out for revenge on a specific person, because they could just use a simple timer device or other ignition device and allow the bomb to go off at a specific time or location. And in that case, they're not really targeting a specific victim, rather a group of victims, or they're just fucking insane and don't care who they kill. The majority of bombers, like the one who delivered the package to Steve's office, like the game of having to keep the device steady as they deliver it. It's like a quest for them. So that was an important tidbit for the investigators to keep in their back pocket, in case there were any witnesses inside the judge building. Not that I want to give any explosive device lessons here, but a mercury switch is normally a glass ball or glass tube that is filled with mercury. Mercury is a liquid metal, and it usually takes the form of a ball or a bead, which, if you've ever seen an old-fashioned thermometer, that is what is inside those. I remember every time we would break a thermometer, Mom and Dad had a hell of a time picking up the mercury off the floor, because whenever you touch it, it kind of breaks into many, many more beads. So trying to clean it up always drove my mom insane. Of course, we as kids thought it was fun to play with the mercury, so we would always try and break it into as many beads as we could. We went through quite a lot of thermometers when I was a kid. The 70s, back when no one knew any better than to let your children play with lawn darts and mercury. Don't play with mercury, kids. When the device with the mercury switch is tilted to a certain degree, usually somewhere around a 45-degree angle, the bead of mercury will slide down the glass tube or ball, and because it's a metal, it will complete the circuit to the detonation device and ignite the explosive materials inside the pipe bomb. Very volatile, very dangerous stuff. Investigators now had to try and figure out why someone would want to target Steve. They learned that Steve had recently resigned as Vice President of Consolidated Financial Services, also known as CFS. It was some type of real estate investment company. The company, CFS, at the time was having serious financial difficulties. According to some newspaper articles, there were a lot of angry investors that had invested their money and their life savings with CFS. And CFS had lost thousands and thousands and thousands of their investors' money. Police started to interview people who were inside the judge building that morning. They came upon a man who owned a jewelry business on a lower floor from Steve's office. Bruce Passy, the witness, told the police that he had seen a man in the elevator that morning holding a box, and that box had the name Steve Christensen on it. Bruce said the man holding the box was white, about 5'8", with brown hair, and wearing a green letterman's jacket, but that the jacket had no letters or insignias on it at all. Janet McDermott, the woman who had seen Steve in the hallway right before the bomb went off, told police that she remembered noticing that there was a box sitting in front of Steve's office on the floor as she was saying good morning to him. Other than those two witnesses, the investigators had little to go on. Security cameras weren't a prominent thing to have in office buildings back in the day, so they only had Bruce's description and the little that Janet had seen in the hallway that morning. A little more than an hour after the bomb exploded, killing Steve, another bomb exploded at 4630 Naniloa Drive in Holiday, Utah, which is about a 15-minute drive from Salt Lake City. 50-year-old Kathy Sheets had come home that morning and found a box wrapped in brown paper with her husband Gary's name written in black marker. Kathy picked up the box to take it inside for Gary, and that was when it exploded, killing her instantly. Gary Sheets, Kathy's husband, was the former business partner of Steve Christensen at the real estate investment company, CFS. Police found similar debris at the Sheets home as to what they found outside of Steve's office. And they found 2 scraps of brown paper amongst the debris. One read Gary and the other read Sheets. So investigators knew that Gary was the intended target of the bombing. They also found a mercury switch, just like the one found at the crime scene where Steve was killed. Investigators knew the 2 bombings were related. There were just too many similarities. The boxes used to deliver the pipe bombs, the same type of tape was used on both packages, the size of the pipes themselves were the same type of explosive was used inside the pipe bombs, and the fact that Steve and Gary were former partners. Once investigators discovered the financial issues at CFS, they started to think that the bomber could possibly be an angry investor who had lost their life savings through Gary and Steve's company. Investigators started canvassing the Sheets' neighbors to see if anyone saw anything, but the only witness they could find was a 13-year-old boy named Aaron Teplick. He said he was looking out his window the night before and happened to see a tan Toyota minivan turn into the Sheets' driveway, and it turned off its headlights as it entered the drive. Aaron thought this was weird, and that was the reason he kept watching the van. He said that a few minutes later the van drove out of the driveway and drove away, but because it was almost midnight, he couldn't see what the driver looked like. Investigators took samples of the gunpowder used in both pipe bombs and sent it to the ATF labs for analysis. The ATF is the Department of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in the States. Apparently, they keep samples of every known gunpowder ever manufactured. And I have decided that I don't ever want to work at the ATF facility where they keep that collection. Can you imagine? Go out for a smoke break at 10 a.m. and blow everything up within a 200-mile radius? No, I'm good. The gunpowder inside the 2 explosive devices was identified as Hercules Bullseye brand. And once they had the bombs rebuilt, the police realized that inside each pipe bomb, the bomber had taped more than 100 masonry nails inside the pipe bomb. Meaning, when the pipe bombs exploded, these nails all became projectiles. These pipe bombs were built to kill whoever moved those boxes. The very next day, a third bomb exploded. This time, it was in downtown Salt Lake City and inside a parked car. The victim was 30-year-old Mark Hofmann. Hofmann was the Rare Documents dealer that sold Steve Christensen the white Salamander Letter. Mark was a Rare Documents dealer, but he wasn't just a documents dealer. He was almost like a rock star in Rare Mormon document dealing. Mark was also an expert on Mormon church history. In 1980, Mark had found the Anton transcript inside an old Bible that he had bought. The Bible was supposed to have been a Bible owned by the granddaughter of Joseph Smith, the founder of the LDS. Mark's wife, Dory, was looking through the old Bible he had bought and found 2 pages stuck together. Mark pried the 2 pages apart, and there, tucked inside, he found the Anton transcript. The Anton transcript, also known as the characters document, is a small piece of paper that contains characters that Joseph Smith copied from the gold plates, which, as we learned earlier, were basically the foundation of the LDS Church. In 1828, the transcript was given to Charles Anton, a scholar, and he was asked to give his expert opinion on the authenticity of the characters that Joseph Smith claimed were from the golden plates. But Anton, after hearing how Smith had found the golden plates, refused to authenticate the transcript. From what I could figure out reading through the history of this church, Joseph Smith felt that the characters on the transcript were a representation of ancient Reformed Egyptian, but Anton felt that the characters and the translation of them, ergo the foundation of the LDS Church, was all a big hoax. So the Anton transcript was another really important document for the LDS Church, because depending on whether it was authenticated or not, it could also be an embarrassment to the church or validation. Hofmann had also discovered a document that outlined evidence that Joseph Smith had appointed his son as his successor as leader of the church, not Brigham Young. Brigham Young was the second president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints after Joseph Smith. But if this new letter that Hofmann had discovered was correct, it means that basically the church had been stolen from Joseph Smith's lineage. This letter had the potential to alter the future of the church. If it was authenticated, a descendant of Joseph Smith could technically come and take over the church. Mark had offered this letter to the LDS Church for purchase, but the church felt that Mark's asking price was way too high. So Mark took the document to a different church. This was sort of a branch off or a break off of the LDS Church. Mark took the document to the RLDS Church, which was known at the time as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now it's known as the Community of Christ Church. The RLDS Church believed what this document was stating, that the descendants of Joseph Smith were the true, actual leaders of the LDS Church, not Brigham Young. And so this was why they broke away from the LDS Church. And if they had possession of this document that Hofmann had found, they would have validation in their beliefs. But when the LDS Church discovered that Mark was offering the document to the RLDS, the LDS Church agreed to pay whatever Mark wanted. And the letter of Joseph Smith passing the church on to his son was placed in the LDS archival vault. The LDS Church, much like the Vatican for the Catholics, have this huge vault in Salt Lake City, in which they keep their most important and cherished items and documents. No one ever gets to go into the vaults, much like the Vatican. And also much like the Vatican, there are documents, manuscripts, and artifacts and relics that have been placed inside the vault for the express purpose of removing the information they contain from the public. The LDS Church also have a rule that once a document or relic has been authenticated and placed into the vaults of the church, no one is ever allowed to examine it. These tangents about the different churches is really important to the case, and you'll find out why in a little bit. Thankfully, Hofmann survived the explosion, but he had suffered devastating injuries from it. The tips of 2 of his fingers were blown off. A piece of his kneecap had also been blown off and pretty much disintegrated in the explosion. As well, there was a piece of metal that had embedded itself in his knee. Mark told investigators that he had opened the driver's door to his car, and when he did, the package had fallen off of the driver's seat and onto the floor of the car and exploded. But Mark hadn't placed that package on the seat of his car. He told investigators that someone must have set the package on the seat, and he had no idea who it was. Police started collecting and looking at the debris around Mark's car, and they realized that the pipe bomb that injured Mark was identical to the ones that had killed Steve and Kathy the previous day. It looked like Salt Lake City had a serial bomber on their hands. But then, when investigators were trying to recreate the explosion of Mark's car, they discovered something interesting. The way that the explosion had actually happened didn't match with Mark's story. So when a pipe bomb explodes, the 2 end caps blow off of the bomb, and those travel in a straight line. In Mark's case, one of the end caps had been blown through the passenger side door, like clean through, and left a nice end cap sized hole in his door. The other end cap was the piece of metal inside Mark's knee. This meant that the bomb didn't explode on the floor of his car like Mark had said. Because of how and where the end cap had entered Mark's knee, it told investigators that Mark's knee had to have been placed on the driver's seat at the time of detonation, not standing outside the car. And his other leg didn't even have any burn damage at all. That leg was completely unharmed in the explosion, which meant that the uninjured leg was outside of his car when the bomb exploded. The other thing was that because Mark had lost the tips of 2 of his fingers, investigators believed that Mark must have been holding the package when it exploded. In other words, that package didn't fall on the floor of his car. After speaking with detectives, it was determined that Mark had no connection to the CFS Corporation run by Steve Christensen and Gary Sheets. So maybe it wasn't an angry investor who lost money. Mark was well respected in the rare document field, but not a real estate investor. However, the sale of the Salamander Letter did come up, which then connected Steve to Mark. Investigators started to think that maybe their living victim might know more about the bombings than he was letting on. Police publicized the witness accounts from the Judge Building with a facial sketch and the description of the green Letterman's jacket. Tips started to roll in from people who knew Mark, stating that Mark had a jacket exactly like the one described in the press release, and that the sketch of the subject wearing the jacket kind of looked like Mark Hofmann. Investigators then discovered that Hofmann had been living way outside his means as of recently, and that he was in a huge heap of financial debt all over the country. Police obtained a search warrant and searched Mark Hofmann's home. There, they found a green high school Letterman's jacket with no lettering on it, and Mark also owned a tan Toyota minivan. But the investigators needed way more evidence. Anyone could own that type of jacket and a tan Toyota minivan. Police started trying to figure out a motive as to why Mark would want to kill Steve and Gary or Kathy. But there was literally no evidence of anything bad ever happening. And there was no evidence that Mark even knew Kathy or Gary Sheets. The entire time that police were looking into Mark's background, they would present him with some of the inconsistencies in his story and interesting things in his background. But the entire time, Hofmann maintained his innocence and told police that he was in fact a victim of the serial bomber. Hofmann even agreed to take a polygraph test, and he passed with flying colors. Not just flying colors, but he got the highest possible score one can get on a polygraph test, a plus 14. The person who administered the polygraph said he had never seen anyone score that high ever in his entire career on a polygraph test. But according to the polygraph test, Mark was absolutely telling the truth when he stated that he wasn't the bomber and that he was in fact a victim. But investigators were still suspicious of Hofmann. And see, here's where my problem lies with these damn polygraph tests. Even though he passed, police disregarded the results and they continued down the line of investigation that they were on before. But if he wasn't under suspicion, they probably would have accepted the results and said he was innocent. I've said it before and I'll say it again and again and again. Polygraph machines need to be placed inside a museum and labeled as a historic police tool. They're too easy to beat, and people use the results to fit their own narratives. Tangent over, back to the case. Police continued looking into Hofmann's whereabouts on the day that Steve and Kathy were killed. Hofmann was supposed to meet with Mormon church officials to discuss some historical Mormon documents that he was selling. These documents were known as the McClellan Collection. Steve Christensen was also supposed to attend that meeting. The church elders had put Steve in charge of retrieving and authenticating the McClellan Collection. Steve was to ensure that the McClellan Collection was delivered to the meeting on that day with the church officials. Once the collection had been authenticated, a wealthy church member was going to purchase the collection for $300,000 from Hofmann and then donate the collection to the church. The McClellan Collection is a series of writings by William McClellan, who was an early elder in the LDS Church. McClellan had had an abrupt exit from the church in 1838 when he declared that he had no faith in the current leadership of the church and Joseph Smith himself. Many of McClellan's writings were from after his split from the church, and were considered by the current church elders to be potential threats or embarrassments to the church. So they wanted the McClellan collection to put inside the vault. Investigators started to wonder whether Mark's good fortune in finding all these really rare documents was actually a reality, perhaps dumb luck, or was it all too good to be true? Prosecutors from Salt Lake City brought in a forensic document examiner, George Throckmorton. That is a fabulous last name. We're going to call him Throckmorton because I absolutely love that name. Throckmorton was asked to examine several documents that Mark had sold, including the McClellan collection, which portions of it had been damaged or destroyed in the Hofmann bombing. As well, amazingly, the LDS Church agreed to let the FBI and Throckmorton examine the White Salamander Letter. This was a historic event for the LDS Church. They had never brought something out of their vault and allowed someone outside of the church to examine it. Then investigators discovered that Hofmann was in the process of conducting a huge sale at the time of the bombing other than the McClellan collection. This sale was of an original copy of the Oath of a Freeman. The Oath of a Freeman was not an LDS-related document, but it was perhaps the most important American historical document ever. Apparently, Hofmann had branched out into rare documents from American history, and he had been making a really good living doing it. The Oath of a Freeman document is the earliest known document printed inside the United States. It was printed in either 1638 or 1639 by Stephen Day, who, on the boat coming over from England, who had stolen a printing press from a man who had passed away on the boat. Once they reached the United States, Day and his sons founded Cambridge Press. Prior to this happening, all documents within the United States were printed in England and shipped across the Atlantic. So the Oath of a Free Man was a ridiculously important document in the history of America. This is like some Indiana Jones or Ben Franklin in National Treasure shit here. I want to go on a treasure hunt now. Hofmann stated that he had found and purchased the Oath of a Freeman inside a book in a used bookstore in New York. And by the time the bombings took place, the oath was scheduled to be sold for $1.5 million. And remember, we're in 1985 here, so $1.5 million is a ridiculous amount of money. Hofmann had partnered with Justin Schiller, a New York City gallery owner, on the authentication and sale of the Oath of a Freeman. Mark had agreed to a 50-50 split with Schiller, so Hofmann was set to come into some big money, which would conveniently help with his financial situation at the time. But the authentication process was taking a lot longer than Hofmann had thought it would, and the people he owed money to were beginning to get impatient. So, the discovery and sale of the McClellan collection couldn't have come at a more perfect time to bail Hofmann out of the financial pickle he was in and keep his head above water until the Oath of a Freeman could be sold. Throckmorton was busy looking at hundreds of documents that Hofmann had sold over the years. And when looking at the documents under a microscope, Throckmorton found that the ink on Hofmann's documents had cracks in it. He called it alligator ink because when you looked at it, it looked like the skin of, well, an alligator. And Throckmorton wasn't sure why the ink had cracked in such a way. Throckmorton had almost 1,000 documents to examine. Some Hofmann had had his hands on, and some that Hofmann hadn't had his hands on, and really had never been seen by the public. The LDS Church had basically opened its vaults for Throckmorton. Throckmorton decided to make 2 piles of documents. The first pile contained documents that Hofmann had had his hands on at some point, and the second pile contained documents that he had never touched. In the pile of documents that Hofmann had had his hands on, there were over 600 documents. And in every single document in the Hofmann pile, the ink had cracked in an alligatoring pattern. And in every single document that he hadn't touched, the ink did not crack. During the search of Hofmann's home, investigators had found a book that had a recipe for iron galvatinic ink, which is basically black ink that was used in the 1800s, which is when the majority of those documents that Throckmorton is examining are from. Throckmorton cooked up a batch of the ink from the recipe found in Mark's house and wrote on some antique paper with it. Then he applied an ammonia solution over top of what he had written. The ammonia solution helped to oxidize the page more quickly. Once everything had dried, Throckmorton examined the document under a microscope. The ink made from Hofmann's recipe also showed the exact same alligatoring pattern as all the other Hofmann documents. Investigators had also found a receipt to a company named Cox and Clark Engraving, located in Denver, Colorado, during the search of Hofmann's home. The receipt was for 2 zinc etchings for something called Deseret Currency Association. The Deseret, I don't know if I'm saying that right. I could be completely wrong. I have no clue. The Deseret Currency Association was a private organization that issued currency in Utah in 1858. The currency they created was used to pay those who worked for the LDS Church. The 2 zinc etchings were basically printing plates. The name on the receipt, however, was someone named Mike Hansen, with an address of 2730 West 25th, Denver, Colorado. When investigators went to the address of Mike Hansen, it was an empty lot. Investigators needed to figure out how this Mike Hansen was connected to Hofmann and why Hansen's receipt for the 2 etchings was inside Hofmann's home. Investigators decided to check out places around Utah that would be able to make printing plates, and there was only 2. If it so happened that Hofmann had purchased anything from these 2 places, it could indicate that he was forging documents. The first place was Utah Engraving, and the second was Dubusac Printing. Utah Engraving offered nothing to investigators, but then they hit the mother lode when they went to Dubusac Printing. The printer picked up the oath, looked at investigators, and said, "A man named Mike Hansen asked to have this plate made." Then the printer said, and I think this might be my absolute most favorite idiot, dumbass, shit rat, criminal moment ever. The printer said that Mr. Hansen paid us in cash for the printing plate, but he was a couple bucks short, so he had to write us a check for $2 to cover the rest of the bill. And that check was a personal check from the bank account of Mark Hofmann. Well, as I said, I do love a stupid criminal. Investigators were pretty certain now that Hofmann was a forger. They figured that Steve had somehow deduced that Hofmann was a slimy shit rat forger trying to sell fake documents for big dollars and getting away with it. Hofmann had tried to throw the police in a different direction by targeting Gary Sheets, but unfortunately, Kathy had found the package and picked it up. Hofmann was arrested and charged with 27 counts, including first-degree murder, delivering a bomb, constructing or possessing a bomb, theft by deception, and communication fraud. Later, an additional 5 counts of theft by deception would be added to his list of crimes. But his lawyers were able to work out a plea deal with the prosecution. In the end, Hofmann agreed to plead guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder, 1 count of theft by deception, and 1 count of fraud. Hofmann was sentenced to life in prison. The theft by deception was for forging the white Salamander Letter that Steve Christensen had bought. The 1 count of fraud, this is interesting, was for the bogus sale of the McClellan collection. You see, apparently, Hofmann opened his mouth too soon about the McClellan collection, and he wasn't finished forging the entire collection. So every time he had had a meeting with the LDS Church, he had put it off. Enough times that the LDS Church then called in Steve Christensen to go and get the McClellan collection and bring it to them for authentication. According to Steve's widow, Terry, Steve had informed Hofmann that if he didn't produce what he said he had, Steve would have him arrested for fraud. And therein lies the reason that Hofmann felt that Steve had to die. But in this plea deal that Hofmann agreed to, he had to sit down for interviews to explain in detail his thought processes as to who he was going to kill, how he made the decisions, how he made the bombs, and how he was able to create perhaps some of the best forgeries in history. A friend of both Steve and Hofmann, named Brent Metcalf, stated that he had gone over to Hofmann's home the night before the bombing, and everything seemed totally normal. The kids were playing, they were laughing and joking. He stated that the fact that Hofmann was planning to murder someone the next day was just obscene, and that knowing that after the fact just put Hofmann in the most sinister of light possible. Brent stated that when he finally accepted that Hofmann was who and what they were saying he was, it was soul-crushing. Brent had introduced Hofmann to Steve Christensen. And through tears, Brent stated that he felt responsible and that he went through a very long period after the bombings where he wished that he had never been born. He wishes that he could just go back and undo everything. During his interviews after his sentencing, Hofmann stated that he didn't decide who was going to die until the night before the bombings when he was assembling the pipe bombs. The interviewer stated it seemed so sinister to be putting together these instruments of brutality and not yet even decided who was going to receive them. In response to this, Hofmann stated, quote, "My thoughts are that it's no great harm done. They might have died in a car accident. You know, the worthlessness of life or whatever," unquote. Hofmann would state that he justified the taking of life as his own survival and protection of his family. He stated that the bomb he left at the Sheets home was just a diversion, and he didn't care who picked it up. Quote, "My thoughts were, it didn't matter if it was Mr. Sheets, a child, a dog, whoever," unquote. This shit snake is an absolute piece of trash and should be incinerated just like all the rest of the garbage in the world. Hofmann then told the interviewer that the bomb that went off in his own car was actually a suicide attempt. Bullshit. I call bullshit on that one. When asked by the interviewer what he was really going to do with that bomb, Hofmann was completely silent and refused to answer. Yeah, you weren't going to kill yourself, you piece of shit. You slipped when you were putting that in your car and tilted the bomb, and it went off by accident. The majority of Hofmann's documents that he sold pertaining to the LDS Church were all some type of embarrassment or potential scandal to the LDS Church. Hofmann stated in an interview that he wanted to change the history of the Mormon religion. Hofmann had told a friend that he had become an atheist when he was a teenager, and he had grown to despise the LDS Church, mostly because his own family were strict, devout LDS members. After these interviews were completed, the parole board decided that Hofmann should be made to serve his entire natural life in prison, which I found really interesting because I've never heard of a parole board telling you that you can never have parole before you've served any time. Hofmann's wife, Dory, stated in an interview through tears that she wished she had known what he was doing because she would have tried to stop it. But Dory never knew what Hofmann was doing. Inside their home, he had an entire room locked that she was not allowed to go in. And Hofmann used Dory as a pawn in the Anton letter discovery. Remember? He had it inside that old Bible that he bought. He had the Bible sitting out for Dory to look at when she got home. He wanted her to find that Anton transcript. What a piece of shit. Dory divorced Hofmann shortly after his sentencing, and when she visited Hofmann to tell him that she had begun the divorce, he immediately banned her from visiting him. And that was the last time she or their children had any contact with him. Shortly after Hofmann was deemed ineligible for parole ever by the parole board, investigators received a tip that Hofmann had tried to orchestrate a hit on the members of the parole board who had made the decision, and Throckmorton, the forensic document examiner who had found his forgeries. When confronted with the allegations of this potential hit, Hofmann stated to investigators that it was just something he needed to do. Hofmann was then placed on restrictions within prison. Shortly after that happened, guards were checking on him in his cell and found him in a comatose state. Hofmann had been getting sleeping pills from other inmates and had tried to kill himself. He was unsuccessful. Once he had taken the sleeping pills, his arm had somehow ended up under his body, and the blood supply had been cut off to the arm. By the time guards found him in his comatose state, there was no way to reverse the effect of blood loss to the limb, and to this day, Hofmann has no use of that arm whatsoever. Investigators state that there is no way of knowing the extent of the forgeries that Hofmann has sold into the world. He was so prolific. Hofmann is currently serving his life sentence at the Central Utah Correctional Facility. He is not eligible for parole and will die inside his cell alone, just as he deserves. You know, sometimes I just love Karma, even though she can be a bitch. And that, my friends, is the case of the murders of Steve Christensen and Kathy Sheets. My thoughts. What a shit snake. You know, the talent that Hofmann possessed was immeasurable. And if he had only not felt the draw of money and fame, he could have done so much good in this world. He is a terrorist, plain and simple. He is a psychopath who shows no remorse for what he has done except for himself. The only reason that he murdered Steve Christensen was for self-preservation. And he had no reason to kill Gary Sheets, and he didn't even care if it was Gary Sheets that detonated the bomb. When I started this case, I had no idea that it had been made into a documentary on Netflix. But I watched it for some of the information inside our episode today, and I highly suggest that you go and check it out. It's a 3-part miniseries, and it is actually quite well done. But man, the amount of damage that this one shit rat has caused is just staggering. Even with just the forgeries that he created, he caused serious harm to hundreds, if not thousands of people. Because every time any of his documents were highly publicized in the 80s, those who watched the news and saw these things may have questioned their own belief system. That's harm. This guy is monstrous, and he deserves to sit in a cell for the rest of his natural life. You know, getting fame and fortune isn't always the best thing in the world. Sometimes just being happy with what you've got and having your family with you is enough. Whew, what an absolutely god-awful case. Hofmann is just a shit rat, a shit snake, a shit pig. He's all 3 of them combined. Sometimes you don't realize the scope of harm that someone is doing until they're caught. And this man had so much raw talent. Think of the artisticness. I don't even know if that's a word, but the artisticness and the genius that this man, Hofmann, had to possess in order to pull off these forgeries. The scientific mind, the artistic mind. He wrote those letters by hand. He was able to copy that old-timey script writing, that beautiful writing from back in the 1800s. That is talent. And if he had only done it for good. I think with that, we'll leave it there for this week. Stay safe, get your pap test done, and enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.